I love a good courtroom drama. I like watching lawyers work within the established legal framework in order to make a case for a particular position using whatever evidence is available. And even though fiction makes it seem much more common than it really is, occasionally someone who actually did commit a crime will go free because of some technicality related to legal procedure. And in such a case, the person might not receive the verdict guilty, but everyone involved not only knows that they likely are guilty, but knows a lot of the relevant details about how they committed the crime. And they know this because of the weight of evidence in the case. In other words, what individual people can clearly see as true or have strong justification for believing isn't necessarily the same thing as establishing that legally. And that's not even necessarily because the particular case is weak, but rather because of some procedural imperfection. But what if we thought about the case for God's existence, not in terms of a legal case, but in terms of the tight syllogistic argumentation in the field of philosophy of religion? Just as it's possible the evidence in some legal case could demonstrate that a person did a particular thing, but the case might not go through because of some procedural mistake, philosophical arguments for God's existence often give very good reason to believe that God exists, even though some aspect of the argument could not seem to be conclusive, though still very, very likely. And for atheist viewers who think that I'm saying that some particular argument fails, but we should just believe it anyway, I'm not. I think the objections to these arguments have solid responses. But perhaps you as an individual see the force of these arguments, but there's some extremely technical objection that you don't know how to answer. Just as with the court case, you may come to think that some particular aspect of the argument has some sort of weakness. But that doesn't mean that you as an individual can't still see the force of the argument in general. Let's look at an example. Take contingency arguments. Reality has things that are contingent and require an explanation from outside of themselves. A reality also has at least one thing that is necessary and requires nothing outside of itself for existence. One challenge that's brought to arguments like this is to say, perhaps things don't require that sort of explanation. Now, since this sort of a principle undergirds our scientific work and actually is evidenced by 100% of our experience of the world, and chanting quantum mechanics here doesn't really help because, number one, you'd be making the point of this video, and number two, atheists actually need to do quite a bit more work to make that a relevant objection. Now, in such a case, perhaps an individual finds it difficult to uphold this notion philosophically, but that doesn't mean they can't see the force of the argument. And again, these objections have and will continue to be addressed. It's not that I'm telling you to believe bad arguments. I'm telling you there's a difference in an individual's ability to demonstrate the technical success of an argument in all of its nuance, and that same individual's ability to see where the weight of the evidence seems to sit, just like the court case. Now, someone might say, but Braxton, things aren't always as they seem.
Sometimes things aren't what they appear to be, but most of the time they are. Why think otherwise? Why don't you think you know you're not in the Matrix? I think that's crazy.
Or take the Kalam cosmological argument, which famously says everything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause for its existence. And then we reason further that that cause must be God. In defense of premise 2, that the universe began to exist, proponents of the argument might try to demonstrate this by showing the impossibility of a past infinite series of causal events or temporal moments. I've offered this in nuanced ways all over this channel. But perhaps you just can't shake the idea in your mind that though it seems extremely unlikely, maybe there's a non-zero chance that the universe is past infinite. If you're right, it could show that people in the philosophy of religion need to spend more time working on the argument to make it as tight as they can possibly make it. But it doesn't mean that you as an individual can't see the obvious force of the argument. Atheist philosopher Graham Oppy, for example, has argued for the possibility of a past infinite universe. But that's his day job as a philosopher. Personally, it seems that he doesn't buy it.
You could also have quoted me as, in a certain sense, rejecting infinite regress as well. Because there are plenty of places where I've said, if you hold my toes to the fire and you say, what do you think is most likely? I'm going to say it's most likely that there's no infinite regress.
And moreover, he goes on to say,
I mean, what we're going to be arguing about isn't where the truth lies, but rather about the force of the arguments that you can make for the conclusion that there isn't an infinite regress.
And in a certain sense, that's the point of this video. 99% of the videos atheists will make in response to an argument for God's existence will contain objections not unlike those mentioned here. We deal with those all the time on this channel, and it's fine. Objections like these are actually helpful and fun to talk about because they help us to tighten up the argument as much as possible or to get rid of certain defenses, just as a good attorney is looking for the best way to present her case. But as an individual, you can still look at the weight of the case and see the strength in it. If people think contingency arguments can be dismissed because they doubt PSRs, or that the universe is past infinite despite that seeming to result in absurdities, I can only advise that such a person step back from the arguments and recognize the difference between the work of a philosopher to shore up every defense and make it as tight as they can, and an individual's ability to see where the evidence lies, to determine what they as an individual think is likely true. To nutshell what I'm basically saying, these arguments have stood the test of time, and occasionally an objection comes that is what I have in the past referred to as a pinhole sort of objection, something that is extremely unlikely, but still has a non-zero possibility of being true. It doesn't mean that we should throw out the argument on the basis of this extremely unlikely thing. And if you are the person who is wiggling out of the strength of the argument through a pinhole, you might consider why that's the case. I'm not annoyed by these objections. I find them helpful. Philosophers need to tease out all the problems with certain defenses of certain arguments to make the arguments and the defenses of their premises as strong as they possibly can. But that's a separate issue from what you are doing as an individual to see the truth as it is represented through the arguments.